Um,
How is my audio? Is it good?
your audio is good. Okay, Sinead, are you taping?
I am indeed.
Okay.
Hello, everyone. We are here. Grant Cameron and I are here on Grant's channel with the extraordinary Shelli Joye, who we will be speaking to today. Shelli is one in a million, in our opinion anyway. She was born in Port of Spain in Trinidad on the Isle of Hummingbirds and has had the most amazing trajectory through life. And we're very, very, very much looking forward to speaking to her today and learning from her. Just to give you a bit of a background on the very wide variety of things that Shelli has been learning about, working on, publishing, and creating in her life. She has studied David Bohm and the intricate order. She's written a book about developing supersensible perception. She's written books about the Holy Trinity, electromagnetic field theory, art, quantum physics and consciousness, psychedelics and perception, awareness and consciousness, string theory. She has dabbled in psychonautic explorations. She has dabbled in LSD and ayahuasca. She has had some extraordinary experiences there that she's going to be speaking to us about. She is an accomplished painter. She's an accordion player. She built her own ham radio when she was 14 years old. She built her own isolation chamber for internal contemplation when she was being mentored by John Lilly. She has a PhD in philosophy, cosmology, and consciousness. She went to Rice University on a physics scholarship. She graduated with a BS in electrical engineering, a BSc in 1969, a master's in Indian philosophy. She studied Indian and Tibetan theories related to consciousness while living in New York City, and it just goes on and on and on. Shelli is really extraordinary. She has such an incredible depth and variety of information to share with us today. Thank you so much for being here with us today. And hello, Grant, as well. And Grant, please take it away. I know you're just chomping at the bit. We want to ask Shelli all kinds of things today. Shelli, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for inviting me. Yeah.
Beautiful. I guess we can start with sort of a little bit about your background, how you got into the world of the weird, and particularly when it gets to the experience you have with entheogens, which both Sinead and I have spent a lot of time sort of researching. So can you go sort of through your background and sort of give us an insight on how you got to do so much of this stuff? Because you basically start as in science and you move from field to field. So go through that thing, and you've got engineering background, and tie it into this world of the very strange and paranormal that we're all interested in.
Okay, well, you want this in 10 words or less, I'm sure, right?
Yeah.
Well, the world of the weird, I like that phrase. I was born into a weird world for me. I'm transgender, so I lived as a guy named Michael until I was about 50, and then I transitioned, and for the last 20 years I've been Shelli, which is probably why I buried myself in studying things. I was trying to find out why I was so strange, and nobody knew anything about it, and I couldn't tell anyone. I tried to tell my parents at a very early age, but that didn't go over well. My dad was an Air Force colonel, and it didn't. So they convinced me I had to shut up and just be who they thought I was.
Yeah.
But when I was really young, I was brought up as a Roman Catholic. So I went to a convent school when I was 5 or 6 in England. And I remember the nun said, if you pray real hard, you can talk to God and God will answer you. Well, I thought, okay. So I started my life for prayer right then, saying, why did you mess up so bad with me? But seriously, I was somewhat not antisocial, but the little girls wouldn't play with me. I wanted to play with them, and I didn't much like the little boys' games. And so all through my early career and education, I really focused on books and studying and trying to learn things. And I really think it's because of that condition I had that led me to not only study science, because in the beginning I thought science would really have the answer to everything. If science can can make a television and radios and, using invisible waves to communicate, somewhere in all that science, there must be some way for me to resolve my issues. So I really got enamored of science, and especially science fiction too. I I read a lot of science fiction as a kid and saw all the movies I could. And it, uh, it led me to, of course, getting interested in radio. My neighbor was a CIA communications officer. We lived near Washington, D.C., and he had a huge radio tower in his backyard. And of course, all the neighbors said he was messing up their television, but I thought it was really cool. And then our families got really close, and he used to show me his ham radio equipment in the basement, like all these things with glowing tubes, and you could smell the ozone in the air. And he would tune in to radios in other continents. And back then there was no internet, of course, so it was really amazing. And he talked me into learning Morse code when I was about 11 or 12. And he tutored me quite a bit. He was a real good mentor. And I got very excited about radios because, it was very science fiction-y that you could communicate with invisible waves, totally invisible, that no one could sense, and send music and voices. And about that time, television was actually taking off. So even television. But, I thought that scientists knew why things work, and that's really a not true. They don't know why things work. They know how things work because they examine things. They measure things in space-time, and they come up with mathematics that helps them to develop new instruments to do things. But, I was in my fourth year of electrical engineering in an advanced class on electrophysiology of the nervous system. I really liked that class because the teacher had a PhD in electrical engineering, which I wanted to get. And he also had a medical degree. So I thought, wow, here's something really interesting. So I asked, I actually had been a hippie for a year or two by then. I had been taking entheogens and smoking cannabis. And I was kind of a black sheep in the engineering department for a number of reasons. But I was really one of the best students. I got really good grades because I studied all the time. I didn't have much of a social life. So, I asked him something I had thought about for a long time. I said, we were studying electrophysiology of the nervous system. And what did he think about the idea that maybe the electricity running through our walls, the electric fields all around us, and especially the power that's going through our walls, through the circuits, what if it's aware? What if there's a certain awareness or consciousness in the electrical system? Well, the class was small, about 10 kids, and there was a long pause. And finally he said, that's the kind of question we just can't ask in engineering. You need to study philosophy or go to a psychologist, and maybe they have more information on that. Well, I actually looked and I searched, but nobody in psychology or, nobody knew anything about consciousness or was interested in consciousness. And I was interested in consciousness because I wanted to understand why my consciousness told me that I was a girl. I was a woman, a girl back then, but why I was in a boy's body. There was a major mistake here. And so I continued to study and learn, and I looked for places where I could study something about consciousness, but couldn't find it until the people I was hanging out with, who were artists, got me interested finally in reading something about aesthetics and philosophy and mysticism. And I realized when I read my first book, I think it was a book by Alan Watts on mysticism, and he was a very educated, really good writer, very articulate. And I realized that here was a whole area that scientists were really ignoring. And it was data. There was data there from all the mystics and saints and all of the writings, and even conventional religions had been trying to explore this consciousness, these things, when scientists were really neglecting it. It seemed to me. So it really all culminated. I think my life's direction, the course direction of my life, The year before, the summer before my final engineering year, I was in a 5.5 year program. Electrical engineering takes a lot of required courses you have to take. So I sort of spaced them out so I could take English literature courses, which I like too. I liked poetry and pretty much liked everything. I was trying to learn as much as I could to solve. One of the main reasons was to solve my conundrum or to try to understand myself, because I couldn't find any answers anywhere else. And so the summer before my final year, we went to California from Texas. I was living in Austin, Texas at the time. And um, I was talked by my artist friends into taking LSD. And I probably wouldn't have done it as felt that I was kind of an engineer and scientist, and I shouldn't do that because it's probably not a, I don't know what it was, but I read in the Life magazine, the front cover was, many people claim to see God on LSD. I thought, aha, this might answer my question. If I could take this LSD and converse with God somehow, maybe I could solve that deep inner problem that's been bugging me. And so we went up to San Francisco from Ventura, where we lived, and for the summer, I was a apprentice computer programmer at the time at a naval missile range, Point Magoo. So we drove up to San Francisco to the Haight-Ashbury, and it was 1967, and it was an amazing time to be alive. There were all kinds of things going on, but we managed to get uh, several little yellow tabs of what's called Owsley acid, which was probably the purest LSD at the time. And then we drove back down to Big Sur, and around 9 in the evening, we took it. I actually took two of them because I wanted to be sure I could see God, and so,
Wow.
but I think I only needed one, but I've always sort of pushed the envelope, and
Wow.
it was well, you both, I think, probably have experienced entheogens. It was really quite extraordinary, to say the
Yeah.
least. And it was a place called Little Sur Creek, south of Big Sur. A creek actually comes out into the ocean there along Highway 1. And before it goes into the ocean, it pools. It's like a really wide, very shallow pool of water, maybe 18 inches or at the most 2 feet deep. So I found myself wandering and seeing the stars reflected in the water below my feet. And then, it was an exceptionally clear night, moonless night. So, and there was no fog, which is unusual. So it's just a million stars above, and even stars reflected in the water. And as you may know, LSD takes you to very sort of cosmic dimensions that people don't normally even suspect are there. Well, the next day, coming down, I realized that this is a whole area that I haven't seen anything in Scientific American talking about it, consciousness. And I thought, this is really the cutting edge of science. It's like, where the early voyagers going across the Atlantic were worried about going off the end of the world and finding a new world. For science, this was like a whole world that needed to be explored using scientific tools and methods, because God knows what, dovetailing into all my science fiction books I had read. I mean, this might be the secret to telepathy, to interspecies communication, to
Mm.
all kinds of things. So that really, I think, charted the course of the rest of my life, because ever since I've been exploring consciousness, and I continued to explore entheogens. Back in school, we go out on weekends into the nearby forests in Texas and try different things like psilocybin mushrooms, and we actually had a lot of peyote because the local the local uh, in Austin, where I was living at the time, there were a lot of they sold peyote basically at the nurseries where they had all kinds of plants for your garden. They had all kinds of cactus plants, and people I hung out with pretty soon realized that there was peyote among those plants, and they sold peyote buttons. So So I got involved in that. And I also actually managed to experience a Native American church a couple of times. So this all drew me not only into entheogenic exploration, but into religions and philosophy. And I think I mentioned it took me 5.5 years to finish my electrical engineering Bachelor of Science, because I started taking courses in philosophy and um, and actually English literature. I found English literature was more useful. I was reading the Romantic poets. I took a really good course on Byron, Shelley, and Keats, and they were talking about all the things that almost I could experience with entheogens. Um, so let's see. I went to New York with my friends, and we started. My two friends were artists, and actually I was married to one, but I finally told them about my gender issues. So the three of us hung together, and they wanted to become famous artists, I guess. And so they started dragging me to the nightclubs where the artists hung out on Union Square. Max's Kansas City, we'd show up around 11 at night, and all the so-called action would begin around midnight, and a lot of people would show up. And I was a very shy person at the time. I still am kind of shy because I had something to hide, and I
Mm,
felt that I didn't want people to know my condition.
mhm.
However, I found myself surrounded by a lot of transgender people, and they were pretty overt and didn't seem to care about it.
Wow,
Um,
that's very interesting.
and then they started going to the factory on the other side of Union Square, I think 32 Union Square. It was Andy Warhol's factory. And I got to meet Andy, and eventually I started consulting for him. He thought I was really strange, because even though he's surrounded by a lot of freaky people, I get the feeling that he thought I was a freak, because here I was, and I was wearing velvet pants and stuff because I was with artists, but they told him that I had an electrical engineering degree, and I was really kind of shy, and I think I was cute too, but I don't know. So he he hired me. Well, he would never pay people much. He would get people to help. He was very good at motivating people and getting them all enthused. So I became his lighting consultant. I was At the time I was working in the World Trade Center as a lighting engineer. I was sort of the interface between electrical engineering and lights for the airports, lighting control systems. And he needed to know someone who knew about lights because of the lights he used for his films, and he was trying to get into television. He wanted to have an Andy Warhol show, I guess, or something. Anyway, I started painting about that time, because you can't hang around people who are painting all the time and not want to sort of do it yourself to get the experience. And I really found that I loved it. I just fell in love with painting, and I took a bunch of watercolors I did to show to Andy, and he really liked them. He said, "Can I have those?" He would always ask people for things, and he was a collector, I guess. And I thought, "Oh, sure." And I thought, "Oh, maybe he'll give me one of his silk screens, and I'll get rich." But that didn't work out too well. But he did say, I think you should continue to paint. And so I actually split up with my two friends and got my own loft, and I started painting and trying to learn as much as I could about painting. But it was more than just painting, it was learning about consciousness. Because what I would
Mhm.
do was I would microdose with LSD, and sometimes with mushrooms, and I would paint. I would have the whole weekend to paint just by myself, being slightly powered by entheogens. And it was amazing because the way I painted, I used I put the canvas flat on the loft floor, like really large canvases, and I used heat lamps, and I propped up different parts of the canvas so it would act sort of like geology, and I would pour the paint on and watch it move, watch gravity move it. So I realized I was painting with gravity, and I would use the heat lamps to dry up the oceans. If like there's a pool of blue or one color of pigment mixed with water, and I would dry it up, and then I would start experimenting, like mixing soap to change the viscosity, or salt, put a lot of salt into something, or baking soda. So I felt like I was sort of a scientist experimenting with creation. And it, when you're taking LSD and painting, I have to tell you, at least to me back then, you almost feel like you're a little god, a little deity, creating a whole universe, and letting the energy of the universe flow through you into the paint and into the painting. And then, of course, after the painting dried, after a few days, it was just amazing to just stare at it for a long time and smoke a little cannabis. And I was sort of a recluse. I lived by myself in that loft for a couple of years. Before I was also studying consciousness by going to workshops. And that's how I met John Lilly. I had met him once in California at the Navy base where I was working as a programmer. He had brought his porpoises. He had shut down his research with porpoises in the West Indies. He'd been working on what he called interspecies communication. And he was trying to communicate with porpoises, human porpoise intercommunication. But he ran out of money. The National Science Foundation stopped supporting him. And so he decided to sell his porpoises. Well, I think the government talked him into it, of transferring his porpoises to the Navy. And they were going to train the porpoises to take mines into Vietnam, Haiphong Harbor, and mine the ships there, which I thought was a terrible idea. And so did he, but he was sort of in a quandary. So anyway, I would go out at lunch down to the pier. We were on the beach, the Navy base, and I would take lunch breaks, and I saw this guy talking to the porpoises. And finally I went over and introduced myself and said, I'm a programmer here. I'm an engineering student. And why are you talking to porpoises? And so he introduced himself, and we talked for a while, and I found out he was also a ham radio enthusiast. He liked radios a lot, but he also was interested in communicating with not only porpoises, but other entities, which he was doing by taking ketamine. And
Wow.
so,
Can I just ask, Shelly, when was this? Was this during the 60s still? Because I know you started painting in
yes,
1965.
yes.
Okay. And you're in New York at this point, right?
Well, when I met him in California, it was 1967.
Okay.
Actually, the summer
Okay.
of love. It was actually the peak of the hippie movement. So then in 1969, I moved to New York after I graduated in 69.
Okay.
And so I went to a workshop with him, and he had just come back from Chile, where he'd been studying with Oscar Ichazo. I think it was called Araca, was the movement, was the sort of a mystical modern way of changing your consciousness. But they all used entheogens too, because I mean, entheogens certainly fuel any kind of mystical research, I suppose. And so he, at the time in New York, he was getting involved in designing anechoic chambers. Well, actually, more than just anechoic means soundproof. They were sensory deprivation chambers, he called them. And they would have warm water that was just a couple of degrees below human temperature, like about 95 degrees. You would float in this salt water in a really, really totally quiet, totally light-proof kind of a booth, like a large washing machine, I guess, maybe bigger than that. And he would take his favorite entheogen was ketamine, which is a little bit like speed, I suppose, but also has more psychotropic properties. So I talked with him, and I had a loft where I'd been painting, and I wanted to start to make my own sensory deprivation chamber in which I would meditate. And I had also been studying with a young Tibetan tulku. His name was Chogyam Trungpa Tulku, who later founded Naropa, the graduate school in Colorado. And I started being sort of a Trungpa groupie. I would go to his retreats in Barnett. He had a place in Barnett, Vermont, and I would go to all his lectures. But I was trying at the time to visualize a Tibetan tanka. One of their ways of strengthening your consciousness and is by visualizing a visual image, a tanka of a Tibetan saint or some symbolic image. And so I made an anechoic chamber or a soundproof, lightproof, pretty much by rolling up a lot of very large canvases that I use for painting. And he helped me. He said that by using empty egg crates, that helped quite a bit. So I began doing a similar thing that he did. I would take a microdose and go into this light-proof, soundproof space to meditate. And one Easter, I actually freaked myself out a little bit because I'm from Trinidad. I was born there, and I only lived there for about a year. But I was really interested in voodoo as something that might change your consciousness. I was also interested in magic for a while. I live near Samuel Fields bookstore on the Lower East Side. If anybody knows about Fields bookstore, that's where they had all kinds of books he brought in from different religions and the occult and Madame Blavatsky and anthroposophy and everything. So I spent weekends finding books in Weiser's, and some of them were on voodoo. So I decided this one Easter Lent, for 40 days, I decided I wouldn't have any electricity in my loft. At night, I would just use candles. And strangely enough, I found a skull in a closet in the loft. There was a strange closet in the loft. And when I was moving in, I found a skull in the upper area of the closet on a shelf.
Wow.
Yeah, so I put the skull between a couple of candles,
Oh my gosh.
and I used to meditate, and I would listen to. I got records that are recordings of original voodoo ceremonies from the West Indies. You can actually check out records, vinyl records from the New York Public Library, which I did. Well, at one point, I suddenly got really scared. I mean, the hair on the back of my neck, I mean, all over kind of got electrified. I realized that I maybe was experimenting with things I shouldn't, because I just got sort of freaked out, and I blew out all the candles and put the lights on and decided maybe I shouldn't go in that direction.
Wow.
So the direction I did go was pretty much into Indian yoga, Asian yoga, and Tibetan Vajrayana, combination of Tibetan and Indian practices and traditions. And I think I meant to talk about Alan Watts. How I got from New York to San Francisco to study Indian philosophy was I went to a workshop with Alan Watts. And I had really loved reading Alan Watts. I read all of the books of his I could find, including his biography, which he wrote, a very nice biography. I forget the name of it, but then I heard there was a workshop he was having, a 3-day workshop. So I signed up for the workshop, and I loved the workshop. It was, he read from some of his books, and we talked a lot. There were about 12 people. But during one of the days' lunch, I said, I really want to study Sanskrit and Asian philosophy. And I've been buying a lot of books and reading them. He said, you know what? I've just been associated with a school in San Francisco, and it's a graduate school now. They just got their graduate program figured out. And you should write off for a catalog for them, because it would be an ideal place for you to study comparative mysticism. So I was working on the 64th floor of the World Trade Center at the time as an engineer. And on weekends, I was painting and meditating and going to, lectures and workshops on consciousness and mysticism. Well, of course, back then there wasn't much about consciousness except for very few scientists seem to have gone into mysticism or consciousness, except maybe Timothy Leary and Richard Alpert. They were kind of my heroes at the time too. So I did. I got very excited about leaving engineering and going to San Francisco and seriously studying Sanskrit. I guess the reason I wanted to study Sanskrit was to study Patanjali's Yoga Sutras. In all the books I had found, Patanjali's Yoga Sutras seemed to be the most clear, concise, and organized book on different stages and states of meditation. And I was still a nerd trying to study things, and I thought, this is something I really should try to understand. So I found myself getting 2 or 3 different translations by different people, and I was shocked that the translations could be so divergent, so different. Like, one yoga chitta vritti nirodha. Somebody would say it means absolute cessation of thinking. The other would say attenuating the mind. And they used English words in a very loose way that often it didn't seem to me to correlate with the Sanskrit. So I really wanted to study Sanskrit. Of course, my father, who had retired to Texas at the time, an Air Force colonel, he was pretty down on that idea. But I said, he thought I was going to ruin my career. Um, but I did. I applied and was accepted. And eventually I moved to California to study Indian philosophy. The other thing was I wanted to find a guru. A lot of things I read said you had to have a guru. I was a little suspicious of that because I thought, who was the first guru's guru?
Mm,
So there must be, you must be able to learn from books. Eventually I found something that Rudolf Steiner said very nicely, that, your teacher can be a book. Teacher doesn't have to be a human being. It can be a book. A teacher can even be yourself if you're lucky and you're sincere and you observe yourself. I think Gurdjieff said the same thing. So, but I thought I really wanted to find a community of people who were sincerely looking to develop and evolve their consciousness using traditional ways, maybe entheogens, and also science. So I thought, this was the cutting edge of everything to me. Um, so I did. I applied and I went there and got involved in the school. And after about a year or two, I found that the modern gurus, are not really very helpful. They sort of seems like when they get a little bit of power, it goes to their head. And the Indian gurus are sleeping with all of their female devotees,
yes.
and it just something was not serious about it.
Yes.
So I just studied real hard, and I wrote my master's thesis on the history, philosophy, and practice of Tantra in India. I guess the reason I picked Tantra was because one of the main tenets of many of the Tantras is to unite the male and female within your own consciousness. And
Mm,
I felt that somehow I had that, or something was trying to do that in me. And
mhm.
so I got really interested in Tantra. And I was kind of shocked as I learned more about Tantra. It's more about dealing with energies and the alchemy of the energies of consciousness, much more than just physical sex. And most of the tantric workshops being offered in California back then and even now are mainly focused on physical sex, not what tantra it really is. I mean, that's just like one small part of it. Um, maybe it's similar to the way that people who say yoga, they think yoga is a physical exercise. When they say yoga, almost, I would say 95% of Americans would think, oh yeah, it's that physical exercise where you
Yeah.
stretch here.
Yeah.
It's not. If you read Patanjali's yoga, the physical exercise is asana is only one of the eight parts of yoga. And the real goal of yoga is to be able to develop your consciousness through different levels, so you begin to perceive and communicate with other dimensions of consciousness, all the way up to what I call the implicate order, the ground of consciousness, which the physicist David Bohm thought that I have a good quote that I use a lot. David Bohm is a physicist who said consciousness is basically in the implicate order. So uh, I've told you quite a bit of my background. Oh, well, I eventually I met another student in the graduate school after I had graduated with my master's degree, and we got married and had a son and a daughter, and moved to Abqaiq, Saudi Arabia, where we lived for 20 years in the desert, which
Wow.
turned out to be a great place to meditate because it's really quiet there. Um, I would get up early in the morning, and I'd have to go downstairs and turn off the air conditioning system, and because then it would be totally quiet in the house. And I was able to read a lot too in Saudi Arabia, and finally we came back in I think it was about 1999, and we to San Francisco, and I started painting a lot more, trying to get into a gallery. Then I entered a Master of Fine Arts program at JFK University, and I wasn't interested in the studio art because I'd been painting by then for 30 years. So I had my own ideas about painting and the style I was in, which is like painting with gravity is what I did. Um, but I was really fascinated by the philosophy. We had two philosophy courses we had to take in aesthetics, and I loved reading philosophy. So one of the librarian there had just gotten his PhD from the California Institute of Integral Studies, which actually had been my old school. It was formerly named the California Institute of Asian Studies, but now it was the California Institute of Integral Studies. So I sent out for a catalog to them, and I read some things about Brian Swim and some of the other professors there, and I applied for a PhD program. So I I jumped from an MFA program to a PhD program. I've always been a sucker for degrees, so um, that's why when I read mystics, if I find a mystic who has a higher degree, a PhD or something, I'm 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 more likely to read them more carefully than others. But anyway, that's just my own prejudice, I suppose. So I was studying. I finished all my coursework, and this was about 2012, I guess. And I had to start writing my dissertation. So I wanted to be somewhere where I could meditate and be very quiet. And I managed to find a little cedar cabin where I live now up near Mount Lassen in the Southern Cascades. It's the very far northeastern part of California. And I'm up around 4,500 feet. It's in the forest. It's very quiet here. And I brought all my books, and I kept acquiring more books. Thank God for Amazon. We get books on demand almost. And I was able to really go in depth into what I was always interested in, was what is consciousness, and what are the connections with science, with all of the tools of science that we know and understand. How can we begin to understand what consciousness is? Because really, modern science has almost no good theories of consciousness.
Mhm.
Um, and then I started reading Carl Pribram, who had been working on trying to find the source of memory. And I discovered that he worked together with David Bohm, the physicist, for the last 10 years of David Bohm's life. And David Bohm even started having dialogues with Krishnamurti. Krishnamurti, of course, he was supposed to be the new avatar that the Theosophists put forward, but quite an amazing mystic himself and quite articulate. So David Bohm wanted to learn more about mysticism and the mind, and Krishnamurti wanted to learn more about physics and how quantum physics might inform him about the mind. And they started having dialogues together. And you can actually, there are a lot of books and YouTube videos of them. And I started reading all the source material that David Bohm wrote on consciousness and his theory of the implicate order. And my mind just flashed with understanding for the first time that this really, really does make sense. And there's Bohm's idea was that the whole world is divided into two, the entire universe. In fact, he wrote a very good book called Wholeness and the Implicate Order, wholeness with a W. He was interested in the whole, that he was very critical of engineers and physicists who didn't seem to care to try to understand the ontological meaning behind science, behind their physics and their equations. Their main objective was to get the equations to work so they could predict the results of experiments and design devices, like iPhones and atom smashers and things like that. And I mean, as an engineer, I was always sympathetic with using science to develop new equipment. But working on my PhD, I was more interested in the ontology of things. Why why, what is the universe? What is this whole thing? So Bohm actually showed the mathematics that worked, that showed that the universe has two major domains. One is space-time, which he called the explicate order. And space consists of three dimensions. You know, if you look at a graph, a three-dimensional graph, you'll see three axes at 90 degrees to one another. There's X, Y, and Z coordinates. And time is one dimension because time goes in one direction. So space-time, it covers four dimensions. And pretty much modern science is built on examining space-time. But quantum mechanics started doing these particle accelerator experiments that they couldn't get the math of space-time to really predict the results of the quantum mechanics experiments. They were getting all kinds of data that eventually showed that there were more dimensions than just four. And this led to the development of what's called string theory in the 80s, and then M theory a little bit later. And what string theory says is that there are 11 different distinct dimensions. That means that every dimension is a different dimension, but the reality has to have 11 dimensions. And I think M theory says there's 12. And then there's been some eccentric scientists who say there's even more dimensions than that. But they say that these extra dimensions, in fact, they've given them some strange names. Like, well, actually, one of the dimensions is called strange. So they say they're very, very small dimensions. And instantly that raised a flag in my own mind, because how can you know, small is only something that has to do with space. So, you know, if it's not part of space, how can you even say it's small? Well, David Bohm's mathematics started proving, showing how he could predict a lot of the experiments that were coming out of particle physics, but it postulated that there was a dimension or a region of reality he called it the implicate order. And I'll jump ahead a little bit to tell you that I believe the implicate order is the same region of reality that in Vedanta is called Brahma. The Buddhists, I think, call it the void. Western religions tend to call it God. So the implicate order, David Bohm said, begins at a very small dimension, below 10 to the minus 35 meters. So I'll explain that. In order for the father of quantum physics, Max Planck, back in 1898, he solved a huge problem that people were having with dealing with thermodynamics and heat by proposing that space and time were not linear. In other words, space and time jumped. They're some kind of digital. They're not smooth. So what I mean by not smooth is, like, if you looked really with a magnifying glass on the pixels of your monitor, you would see that it's made up of a lot of little dots, you know, little pixels. But because they're very, very small and they stream by so fast, it gives you the illusion that they're connected, that they're linear, that they're continuous. Well, they're not continuous. They're separate little dots. And so the idea in quantum mechanics is that space stops at 10 to the minus 35 meters, that there's no space below that. And time also is granular. Time is, there are 10 to the 44 ticks per second. It's a huge number. I mean, our computers run at like 10 to the 14th maybe at the most. So 10 to the 44 is an enormously smaller granules of time and space. So if you imagine at the bottom of space, I have some diagrams, which maybe we can show somewhere else, but they're in my books, the diagrams that show that if you shrink down like Alice in Wonderland, and you get smaller and smaller, you can't continue. You reach the point where you're down to the 10 to the minus 35 meters, and you can't get any smaller. So David Bohm said, if you take a little tiny micro black hole And the diameter of that is 10 to the minus 35 meters. Within that sphere, that little micro black hole sphere, there is no space. There's no space dimension. But within that tiny, tiny micro black hole are the other 11 or 12 dimensions that are posited by string theory that make quantum mechanics work. So there's the explicate order, which is our space and time, which Isaac Newton and all of our scientists even now are mostly measuring things in. They measure space and they measure time in their experiments, and they make sure that the experiment can be repeated, and they come up with mathematical equations that map space-time. But in subquantum, below the quantum mechanical level, there's the implicate order. And Boehm showed through a model, a mathematical model. He wrote the textbook on quantum theory, by the way, in 1951, I think. So he was a really, really brilliant quantum mathematician. He showed that space-time is projected from within the implicate order. So down there at very, very tiny, tiny dimensions, below the level where space-time exists, within the implicate order, there's some kind of reality that projects the universe outward. And at the same time, all of the information within the universe, all of the data, the information of things moving in space and time, they are projected back into the implicate order. So it's a two-way thing. You can also visualize it by the yin-yang symbol. The yin-yang symbol is the symbol of Taoism, many people say, and it shows that there's two regions and they're sort of swirling into one another. So this actually correlates with everything we know about quantum mechanics right now. The whole idea that scientists for a long time were really concerned because as information goes into a black hole, they say it's lost to the universe. They say, why is all this information is lost? As information flows into a black hole from outside, it'll never come back into the universe. But actually, it correlates very well with the Vedantic idea of the Akasha. The Akasha is supposed to be this sort of a timeless, spaceless place where all of the information of the universe is stored up. And it's out of that implicate order, or Akasha, I equate the two, out of that the universe is projected. And according to the mathematics of David Bohm, the universe is projected many, many, many times a second. It's like a digital universe, 10 to the 44 clicks per second. When we say per second, it's one of our seconds. We're human beings, and we're actually enormously huge compared to the little tiny implicate order spheres, the holospheres, that are the bedrock of the universe, and out of which consciousness projects the universe and views the universe as a whole. So, it's hard to put this in words because I have a 300-page book that describes it with 61 diagrams. And actually, I just finished publishing my 15th book. What I've tried to do in all my books is write the books so that people don't need to understand calculus, or even, even trigonometry might help, but I try to make it so that the average educated high school, college, say American, would be able to understand it. I try to explain things with diagrams and visual diagrams and words without using mathematics, so people can get a flavor and visualize what's going on.
Can I ask a question in terms of the implicate, the expletive order, in terms of your basic worldview? So do you see consciousness as primary, which creates the physical world? Because a lot of this stuff, like with string theory, it seems to be, it still has nouns, like certain number of dimensions, strings, granular, this, that. It seems very sort of left brain. So in terms of the people, like, for example, now Deepak Chopra, or I don't know if you studied Donald Hoffman, where they're saying there basically is no time and space. There's everything is in action inside consciousness. And in terms of that, what's your worldview in terms of defining consciousness, intuition, noetic material, and where are you when you're in a state, say an LSD state? Where are you? How does the mind fit into this worldview of, say, David Bohm and consciousness?
Well, consciousness is primary, and I agree. You know, being a nerd, I've read all kinds of Indian philosophy books. Of course, I got a degree in that, and then and Hoffman, and I try to read everything I can, and I search for correlations where things where maps. If you put one map over another map, where the patterns coincide. So if things make sense in one subject and you find a similar pattern in another subject, I tend to believe that there's some credibility there. So I would say, going back to say philosophy, Western philosophy, I would be a panpsychist. Panpsychism is believing that everything has an element of consciousness, that consciousness is the bedroot of the universe. Um, One thing I criticize a lot and mention in my books is that, you know, modern neurophysicists and neuroscience is looking for consciousness uh, as a derivative of an activity of neurons in the brain, the nervous system. And many people in those fields still believe that consciousness is an epiphenomena. It's something that just emerged out of the activity of neurons. And it was maybe a lucky thing, but it wasn't designed. It was just something that happened by accident. Well, that sounds superstitious to me, I have to say, because everything is so amazingly intricately designed in a way that, you know, there's got to be something that's not just serendipitous. Accidental things don't seem to happen in that way. And so and many philosophers have advocated panpsychism, that there's a basic underlying substructure of the universe is consciousness. And of course, David Bohm, going back to him, he said consciousness is in the implicate order, and it's projecting. It's a one. Consciousness is one, because, well, he wrote wholeness and the implicate order. He believed that there's one primary consciousness, and it is projecting the universe out from the implicate order into the explicate order. And each one of us have what we think is consciousness, but you can think of it in the analogy or the metaphor might be a colander. You know, a colander that you put your lettuce in, and it's a hemispherical bowl that has many holes in it. Well, you can think of the one consciousness as being the lettuce in the middle of the colander, and each one of us is a consciousness stream coming out of a separate hole. So we think we're separate, but we're really not. We're ways for that one consciousness to examine itself and to enjoy itself from different perspectives. Each one of us has a different perspective, and not just each one of us as human beings, but every. I think it was it Leibniz, the idea of the plenum, that there's a plenum of like the substrate of the whole of all of reality is this infinite plenum of little tiny spheres, and they would be equivalent to Bohm's micro black holes, the little hollow spheres that have a diameter of 10 to the minus 35 meters. So I've got some illustrations of these in my books, that at the very bedrock of reality are these you know, infinite number of tiny centers. You could call them a center also, because from each center, the universe is projected outward. And not only is the universe projected outward, but that consciousness is looking out from the center into the universe that it's projecting. And what really constitutes this in science, verifies it in a way, is the whole idea of the hologram. Because the idea of a hologram is that you have electromagnetic fields are coming out from different points and intersecting. And where they intersect, the flux becomes deeper and starts to create forms. And these forms create things like what we call protons and electrons and atoms. and these atoms form molecules, and these molecules form uh, structures, crystalline structures and non-crystalline structures, and all the way up that the universe is being projected by a conscious entity that many religions call God, and I think Buddhism calls the void. And it's a place where yogis and mystics and shamans actually go. They can actually resonate with it, and that's the whole goal of learning to meditate and develop contemplative skills, is to be able to resonate with the implicate order, with these much lower, higher energy regions of reality that
Shelly,
are,
may I ask you a question about this actually?
yes.
Because I'm very interested in your view of cosmology. You know, I do know a bit about the shamanic path. I'm on the shamanic path myself, although very, very early in. And so I've just started the study of cosmology, and I'm very interested in your understanding of cosmology in connection to what you just said, because that is kind of on the shamanic path anyway. That's what helps us understand where the shamans go and what that space is about and how we can utilize it here in this dimension. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Well, yes, I can. It opens up the whole idea of tuning, tuning. The first book I wrote after my dissertation was called Tuning the Mind: The Geometry of Consciousness, and it has to do with, with uh, we can tune our consciousness to other frequencies. When I say frequencies, um, this has to do with the consciousness having a really strong electromagnetic field component. In fact, my most recent book, which probably they sent to you, is The Electromagnetic Brain, EM Field Theories on the Nature of Consciousness. It's the electromagnetic fields that project holographic images into space-time. And part of being a mystic or a shaman or a yogi or just a modern neo liberal contemplative, I suppose, is learning to tune your mind into other regions, other dimensions. Um, when I say other dimensions, it's the analogy is like this. Radios. People used to drive their car and they would tune the radio stations. People say tune the radio stations. You would turn a knob and you would actually change the receiving frequency of the radio waves. All of the stations are coming through at the same time. In fact, every radio station right now is going through each one of us right now. We can't get the information from it unless we build a radio with circuits that have filters that filter out everything but one frequency, a small frequency range, and that we call a channel. So in that channel, the information we want to look at would be like, say we have a CNN channel, for instance. But in radios, it's even more pure because you're just dealing with electromagnetic fields that go through everything. Um, I think you mentioned I built a radio station when I was 12. I was a ham radio licensed. My neighbor got me into it. And I still think it's amazing how radio waves work and radios work. Um, right now, the big thing in amateur radio or ham radio is using your computer with radio waves. You hook up your computer to a transceiver. A transceiver is a radio that not only receives, but it also transmits electromagnetic fields. So there's a big, it's almost a hobby right now. Well, you could say it's a hobby, but it's people are trying to communicate with as low power as possible. It's been going on for about 10 years in amateur radio. They're saying, how far can I communicate with someone at a really low wattage, really? So it's called QRP. And I have a radio that sends out 5 watts of electromagnetic energy. Well, 5 watts is the same as a flashlight. When you turn on a flashlight, and I mean an ordinary flashlight, not the powerful ones. So the light from a flashlight going out is electromagnetic radiation. It's in the visible range, but you could pick any range to send out 5 watts. And my little 5-watt transceiver uses the computer to, uh, to, to, to detect and decode very sophisticated algorithms. Um, the software was developed to detect signals bounced off the moon. That's another thing that ham radio operators like to do, is bounce their radio signal off the moon, and several minutes later they get the signal back. And they actually communicate with each other by moon bounce. But to do that, they have to use this very sensitive software that runs in the computer really fast to decode the signals. Well, I've been able to communicate. I made a communication with using 5 watts with a Soviet, well, not Soviet, it's Russian now, the Russian Antarctica base. They have ham radio operators that for their spare time they try to communicate with people in the outside world. So I've actually carried on uh, conversations using my computer and 5 watts. So my antenna is sending out 5 watts. It gets all the way to the Antarctic. They decode it, and then they send me back a signal. Well, the human heart puts out 5 watts. Every heartbeat that you do, your heart puts out 5 watts of what? Of electromagnetic energy. And people don't realize that because they get mixed up with the terminology. Even scientists, I've noticed, get really mixed up. They use the word heat, H-E-A-T, heat and warmth. Well, heat is a human way of sensing electromagnetic radiation in the infrared frequency range. In other words, there's a certain channel of electromagnetic waves that is called infrared. It's a little bit below red. That's why they call it infrared. Infra means below. So there's a certain several channels of light, of electromagnetic radiation, which is light, that we can see. Red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet. But the just below the red that we can see is infrared. You can't see it. However, you can see it with a night vision goggles that the military hands out to snipers and soldiers. You put on a night vision goggle, and these special optical detectors tune into the infrared channel and pick up the infrared that's coming off of a human being from a mile or two away. So every human being is radiating electromagnetic energy, and it peaks in the infrared. Although when I say peak, there's a lot of frequency channels right next to it that the human body is still putting out. So, I realize that our hearts putting out 5 watts of energy is no different than my little, my computer and my radio that I transmit 5 watts of information to Antarctica from Northern California. So what that implies is incredible. That means that we probably are capable of communicating with one another through the radiation given off by our body, by our hearts. And
Wow, Shelly, this is incredible. I have to jump in here. I am so fascinated. I mean, I could just listen to you literally for days. My heart is pounding because I'm so excited. You are just lighting my brain up in all these different ways that are really making me happy. And I think Grant is probably having the same experience. This is so fantastic.
well,
I just want to jump in because you're talking about you're sort of alluding to, electromagnetic theory, or talking about electromagnetic theory. And that reminds me of what you said when we were emailing back and forth prior to this interview. You said that you had changed your view of electromagnetic theory after you had your UFO experience in 1968 in Texas when you were 21 years old. And I'm wondering if you can please talk about that, because I'm very curious to know if that has anything to do, what created this UFO experience? What were you experimenting with radio there? Were you experimenting with, the heart consciousness, the electromagnetic field that emits from the heart? What was going on, and what was the experience? What happened? We're really dying to know about that as well.
well, okay, sure, I'll do that. I'll just finish the last thought with that Rupert Sheldrake, who I know is quite an amazing guy, and he's been dismissed by scientists because he talks about consciousness, and he is a scientist. He wrote a book called The Sense of Being Stared At, about how people's dogs know they're coming from miles away, and I think that has to do with the heart, the infrared, the energy that's going out all around the world. These signals, radio signals, go around the entire world at the speed of light. So It's a common phenomena, and people use it for shortwave radio. But back to your question, yes, I think I mentioned how I asked one of my professors um, who had a degree in a medical degree, and we were studying electrophysiology of the nervous system. And I asked him, what if the electromagnetic fields in our wires in our house are aware, have some kind of awareness, a distributed consciousness? That means throughout the whole world, there might be this network of awareness in our walls without our realizing it, and we think it's just charging our batteries and running our machines, but maybe it's watching us, or maybe it's ourself watching ourselves. But okay, the experience that I had in Austin when I was, this was about a year, the summer after I had my first experience with entheogens. I had come back and I was studying for my last year in electrical engineering. And I was studying some really esoteric things like laser communication theory and things. But we would go out, especially in the summer, it gets really hot in Austin. And so we would drive out to Hamilton's Pool. It's called Hamilton Pool, about 30 or 40 miles from Austin in the hill country. And there are all kinds of legends in the hill country that there's wood choppers that come out and they chop people up at night. I think that started the Texas Chainsaw Massacre series. But anyway, we went out to Hamilton's Pool because it's this beautiful, maybe 150 foot diameter circular pool of clear water, and one half of it is a sandy beach, and the other half is like a 20-foot high rim where the geological, apparently it was probably a sinkhole that collapsed years ago, so only half of it is there, and a beautiful waterfall comes off from the top and feeds this pool of clear water, and then it goes on down to the Pedernales River. So we had gone there, I guess, about 10 o'clock, maybe we got there. And so we swam a little bit, and then we were leaning against a rock. There were three of us, my wife and her boyfriend. So that's a whole nother story. But we were good friends and we lived together. And we were sort of a famous menage a trois in Austin at the time, I suppose. And I was the shy one. But anyway, we were leaning against the rock, and suddenly I noticed, we weren't talking, I noticed that the crickets stopped chirping. And if you've been in Texas, or probably many, many different forests, at night there's this susurration of chirping. I think it's like grasshoppers or crickets or something, or maybe the little frogs, but there's a murmur of sounds going on in the forest. Suddenly it was absolutely silent. It was like, whoa, deafening silence. And then there was like a light coming from over to our right, way down where the creek drained the pool and went back down toward the river through kind of a swamp. And this light was moving up toward us, kind of up the creek. And we thought, oh, maybe it's somebody with a flashlight. So, we talked about it the next day, but we didn't say anything at the moment. The three of us were silent, just observing the same thing. Finally, this thing came into view, and it was like it looked to me like it was about the size of a small beach ball that was glowing, and it was sort of hovering and moving up and down in a very organic sort of a way. It didn't seem like a machine. It was going over the creek. It was following the path of the water that the creek was draining, and it came up to the pool. And it was just kind of a shock to see that. Not only the sounds went silent, but suddenly there was this glowing thing. And it started moving around the circular rim of the pool. Only half, I think I said the diameter was 150 or feet roughly. It's a small pool, but this thing moved maybe 20 feet above the water. And when it got to the waterfall, it stopped about 10 feet in front of the waterfall, and it bobbed and dipped, I think 3 times. I think I remember it. It went down a real dip and went back up, and then it went down and up. Not like a machine, but it seemed like something that was alive, and it was glowing in a very strange way, very distinct. It then continued around the pool, and it came around toward where we were leaning against a rock, and it stopped right above us. It stopped about 15 or 20 feet above us. And to me, I got a really good look at it. It looked like maybe thousands of little tiny lights, tiny pinpoints of lights moving within the within the region of a sphere. Not, it didn't seem to go outside of this beach ball shape, but they seemed to move like in a straight line, little straight lines, and then they would stop. And there were thousands of them. So it was almost like thousands of little filament straight lines, all kinds of activity going on. And I was just terrified. I think my heart must have stopped because I don't know, are we going to get killed or what? I don't know. It was just so astonishing. And then what seemed like a long time, but it probably wasn't more than a couple of minutes, it was stopped. And then it continued back around the beach until it reached the creek. And then it slowly moved down the way it had come. And eventually it vanished in the forest, or the, the swampy forest on the way to the river. And suddenly all of the peepers came back on. It was like somebody turned the switch back on. And then, I mean, we didn't say anything. We were kind of scared, and we decided to leave. And so we left, and we didn't really talk much on the way home, but in the next day we talked quite a bit about it. And we decided it was, maybe this is what people call a UFO. When they see a UFO, it was definitely unidentified flying object, I guess, but it wasn't going very fast. But it didn't seem like a machine. It seemed like a living thing. And so this kind of fed into my whole fascinating with consciousness. Could this be some kind of it certainly seemed like it was aware and it was doing something intentional. And
Can I jump in with a question here? Because this
yes,
is you're describing what a lot of people describe, where the animals and the sound, all the insects stop, and people have the experience. So my question to you is, and this goes to sort of like a basic theory of the universe: was this random? Because we always say, why do UFOs have lights on them? So you can see them. It's like they want you to see them. So do you think this was a random event? And that goes for your whole life. Like you still look back on your life. Are the events of your life random, or are you picking them, having some control if there's multiple life stuff going on? And that leads into the question with UFO experiencers. 40% of all UFO experiencers claim that at one point during their experience, they knew the answer to everything in the universe. And that it goes with near-death experience as well, where they'll claim that they knew the answer to everything in the universe. So my question, I guess, would be, how much of the world is random, and is everything in a field and you're just tapping into the field like through an electromagnetic thing? And what creates the field? So what creates the electromagnetics? What creates all this sort of stuff? Is consciousness still creating this world of electromagnetic stuff? And this idea of the field and of is the world random, or is it just chance, as evolution would say, that we're sort of like biological robots in a random, meaningless universe?
well, I think it's both. I think there's some randomness built. There's also, it's not totally random like many modern scientists claim. Um, I the I believe that there's one energy. Energy cannot be created or destroyed. They say there's a certain fixed amount of energy. Uh, I never really went deeply into the physics of that, but I kind of took it as maybe that's true. I've always been kind of skeptical of everything myself, but I've observed things and tried to correlate things to reach an understanding of things. Um, in terms of I really do believe that there's now I believe there's an implicate order, and I believe that it is full of information, and I believe all the information from the time space universe flows into it at the center everywhere. Maybe that's what gravity is all about, that the gravity is pulling things toward the center, and then at some point the information enters these microscopic or larger black holes. I mean, the larger black holes probably are black holes that grew from the tiny little Planck holospheres, as I call them, or the little holoflux 10 to the minus 35 meter diameter holes that create the plenum understructure of consciousness that projects the whole universe holographically. Actually, Bohm also said that if we were to remove the lenses of our eyes, the whole universe would look like a hologram. So
But is consciousness creating the hologram, or is the hologram creating consciousness?
well, I believe consciousness is creating the hologram.
And the black holes and everything else, right?
Well, I have a feeling the black holes have always been there. I mean, I would say
But if
the implicate
consciousness
order
is
is
primary, how can he
probably,
still be there?
I don't, for one thing, this is the amazing thing. Outside of space time, within the implicate order, there is no space and there is no time, because space time is other than the implicate order. The implicate order, according to Bohm, is where the other dimensions are rolled up together. And so the implicate order actually is taking all of the information that it has, and it acts like a super computer to compute the next cycle of the universe. But remember, this Planck time constant is 10 to the 44 cycles per second, 10 to the 44 pulses a second. You know, our computer chips right now run at about 10 to the 14th, I think is the fastest they've gotten. 10 to the 14th pulses per second. But if the universe is creating itself and destroying itself 10 to the 44 times per second, that's an enormous number. So my feeling is that the universe keeps generating itself, and much like you see the pixels on a screen create images that seem to be moving and continuous. The implicate order is through these tiny, the plenum of tiny holosphere dots, micro black holes. They're acting like pixels, and they create the three-dimensional universe in time and space, much as the flat pixels do on our screen monitors of our computers and video screens. And so the information it's a cyclic thing. Whatever happens in space-time flows back into the implicate order. Then there's a computation that happens, and then the projection, the next projected state of the universe flows out everywhere from all of those zillions and billions and gazillions of tiny micro black holes that Bohm says the implicate order is in, and that's where consciousness is, and from which the consciousness is looking out into space-time and having fun, surfing.
Well, would Bohm have seen consciousness as the implicate order? Because it still seems to me that if consciousness is primary, it's creating the dimensions, it's creating the black holes, it's creating whatever through thought. So is there still this, or is there a physical world separate from consciousness?
No, there's no physical world separate from consciousness. I think the Vedantic idea that the world is an illusion in a way is the same thing as when we look at our television monitor and watch Netflix. It's an illusion because it's really separate little dots moving sequentially one after the other. But
yeah, so then the dimensions would be illusions as well. That it's created for whatever purpose, almost like the
yes,
Hoffman idea is that they're icons on a desktop, that you can't really see reality itself. You're only seeing the interface to reality or consciousness, which you really can't see.
Yeah, we're almost getting above my pay grade and trying to understand this. Does the implicate order, which has always been there because it's eternal, there's no space and no time. And so any information that flows into the implicate order is immediately available throughout the implicate order because there's no space separating it. There's no time separating that information. So it's operating in parallel. If you understand parallel computing, is things happen at the same time. The new information coming in overlays everything that already is there that's never been lost, the Akasha, and then the universe decides to pop out the next next solution. The solution to every particle and point in the universe is recreated with a slightly new direction or configuration. And I think it's somewhat random because randomness is something that's built into it. And I think, the universe is enjoying it's almost like each one of us is a channel, a different channel. We're a different frequency coming from a different place in space-time. We have different backgrounds. And so we are like different channels, and the universe is channel surfing us as cognitive entities.
Yeah.
And I think it's pretty cool.
Well, what would you say to people like you know that now there's this big movement on AI, that consciousness is an entity, and we're going to take this consciousness and figure out how it works, and we're going to take it and put it into robots, and they're going to be conscious. Do you go along with that idea that you can actually separate consciousness, or is the old idea that the consciousness is will always be separate from a robot unless you've got some sort of biological stuff you can put in the robot? Because the idea I think now is that consciousness is a thing. We're going to figure out what it is, and then we're going to take it and we're going to build stuff with it and make money out of it.
I don't see why consciousness couldn't begin to work inside something of, silicon and
But you'd need
molecules.
biological material, right? You'd need
Um, I,
biological. It's not
I
like,
don't I don't think it has to be limited to biological material. Um,
because
our
my
compu-
idea is that if you take all the computers of the world, you link them all together, and you can wire them, put electricity in them, and nothing's going to happen until there's a consciousness that programs the computers or builds the computers. That there always has to be that biological element. That because the idea to me is always the consciousness thing is when you get enough rocks piled in a big pile and make it complex, then suddenly the consciousness jumps out. Is consciousness primary, or is it not primary?
it is primary, I believe.
Yeah.
That's the whole thing of panpsychism. Um, but it's not limited. It's not limited. That's why I tell people. I mean, I'm a fairly religious person, but I was brought up and confirmed as a Roman Catholic, but then I became a Hindu in my 20s, and I was inducted into a certain tradition, and then I got more interested in Tibetan Buddhism. So Trungpa inducted me into something in Vajrayana. So, and then actually about 12 years ago, I got fascinated by painting icons. I said I'm a painter, so I paint icons. I wanted to paint an icon so I could practice certain contemplative practices with it. Very much like doing tankas in Tibet. Um, the icon becomes like an archetypal doorway or gate into the world of archetypes. I think Jung would have understood that. So anyway, I got really so interested in icons. I went to Russia for a few weeks to study icons with some iconographers, and I realized that that you really can. Well, I finally became Russian Orthodox for a while. I was inducted into what they call it chrismated, and but then unfortunately the Orthodox are pretty conservative. When they found out I was married to another woman, they said I couldn't I couldn't come and pray with them anymore, which was kind of sad. But so what I'm trying to say is I actually believe I accept three very different religious traditions. I don't see why they have to be mutually exclusive. Nor does anyone have to have a religious tradition, although it really is an asset if you're trying to explore consciousness, I believe, because you can communicate with sort of a collective unconscious or collective consciousness, sort of a noospheric thing that Teilhard de Chardin wrote about. One thing I haven't talked about is Teilhard's work, and that was a big part of my dissertation. My dissertation was it was on David Bohm, Karl Pribram, and Teilhard de Chardin, and it was the holoflux theory of consciousness. And the book that I wrote afterwards that really is a rewrite of my dissertation is called Subquantum Consciousness. It's kind of a thick book with lots of diagrams. But I really believe there's a collective consciousness that we tune into when we meditate. Sometime earlier we were talking about tuning and tuning the mind. If you are the first step is to quiet your laptop computer mind. What I mean by that is our normal human cognitive mind is a derived form of consciousness that the primary consciousness, which I believe is like electromagnetic, flows through. And it uses organic material for memory, storing memories and retrieving memories, and comparing ideas and processing sensory systems. And it's not that different than a laptop computer or a desktop computer. And unfortunately, people tend to think that's all that there is, that that's the real them. But the real us is before that. It predates the development of that. That's like a laptop computer, biological device that grows in your mother's room, and it gets booted every morning when you wake up. When you meditate, Patanjali teaches it, and most religions do, even Western Christian traditions. You enter the silence. The silence of quieting the activities of your computer laptop mind. You stop. The part of your brain that forms memories has to quiet and shut down and stop working. The part of your memory that forms words and the normal cognitive channels that it flows through, you learn to quiet them. So you learn to just turn off your normal mind, quiet it down so it stops chattering like a monkey, so that the deeper consciousness, the deeper purusha, they use it, the Sanskrit word purusha, can begin to really listen to what's going on and get outside of itself and communicate with these other dimensions, and learn to begin to tune in to other frequencies, and their actual real frequencies and domains that have consciousness awareness in them. And one of them is the noosphere that Teilhard de Chardin talked about, which is sort of a collective envelope around the earth of our human awareness. There's also a noosphere for frogs, say, a noosphere for dogs. There's noospheres, they're different frequencies, they're different channels. And for trees, a certain kind of a tree species. And this kind of solves Rupert Sheldrake's theories, that how do things get communicated? Like if a animal learns a new trick, how do other species of that animal on the other side of the planet suddenly seem to learn how to do it at the same time? And he's done a lot of research on it he calls them morphogenic fields. But I say it's just electromagnetic fields operating through a collective bandwidth of a certain channel, and that our DNA sort of resonates with a very specific channel that's specific to our species and our particular whatever. It can even be more localized than that. It can be a specific channel, say Trump supporters, people who love Donald Trump or whoever they love. They coalesce around a certain frequency. They go to a certain channel. And I don't mean Fox News. I mean a noospheric channel where there's a collective identity that tuning the mind tunes them into. And you can feel it. And when you meditate, you can actually feel these other channels. If you're lucky and you persevere enough and you practice regularly, you can actually get there through almost any religious practice that teaches even a little bit of mysticism and contemplative practices.
Have you experienced samadhi or nirvana, those kind of things?
Yes, definitely. They're just they're tools that the human biological machine has incipient in it. That they're like seeds that you can grow and cultivate and eventually activate. It's like the cutting edge sensory systems of our bodies, or of our collective neuropsychological mind. We're just on the cutting edge of what we can sense and perceive. And mystics and shamans have been able to activate and use these, let's call them transceivers, since I was a ham radio person. A transceiver, you can receive and also transmit. So when you receive, once I was taking a very strong acid in upstate New York with a friend. We were up on a hill, and suddenly we were in the middle of nowhere, like 10 miles from the nearest road. And we got kind of scared because it seemed like at the foot of the hill, we could hear motorcycles roaring back and forth. And the next morning, we realized that, we were able to hear them, that entity, whatever it was making itself known to us audibly somehow. But if we're aware of them, they're aware of us. It's like if you're aware of a whale, if you see a whale and you're a little fish, well, the whale might be able to see you. And that can be the scary part that gives people bad trips when they take acid or psilocybin or ayahuasca, that that suddenly you can see these things, but you're not able to hide because, you know, you're reaching out and you're touching them with your electromagnetic fields and you're resonating with them. And there's a transfer of information during that resonance. And
So you're in
it's
their field, like you're saying that you're vibrating at their field. So I think you had an experience with beings in your field, in your LSD experience. So are you in the field where you just sort of vibrate at their field and you get in there, and then once you come down, you go back into your lower vibration? Is that how you see it?
yes, that's in a nutshell. That's a fairly good. Yeah, the whole idea of tuning your mind is that through meditation, you know, it's like learning to ride a bicycle. It's very hard to read in words how to get your balance on a bicycle. You have to do it. So by meditating, the first, maybe the first couple of months or years even, you learn to shut down your laptop mind, your cognitive, your memory and stuff. And of course, a corollary to this is if you shut down your memory making function of your mind and you have all these experiences under LSD or ayahuasca, it's very hard to, when you come down the next day or days after, it's hard to remember what happened, because in order to get there, you have to attenuate your memory mechanism. So you're not bringing back very lucid memories.
Yeah.
What you have to do is do these things enough time, say meditate regularly every day if you can for enough months or years, then you start to get a flavor for what happened and you start to intuit what happened, even though you don't have specific concrete memories of what happened. And it develops a faith of, well, I know what happens when I go there. You know, if you hurt your back really bad, I used to have a bad lumbar 5, a terrible, terrible sciatica pain. I can't now remember what the pain felt like. You know, you really can't remember pain.
Mm.
You know, it was bad, but you really can't remember the pain. Neither can you really remember things that happen when you meditate or even take entheogens. Once you've shut down your cognitive mind. And one thing they discovered with was it ayahuasca? I think it was psilocybin. They've done some clinical experiments with psilocybin using MRI techniques to try to see what part of the brain lights up
Yeah.
during the psilocybin technique. And they
Mhm.
were shocked to find that instead of lighting up, all of the areas they thought would light up go dark. They get
Mhm.
quieter than normal. So that's
Mhm.
sort of, that is one of those overlays that I believe helps indicate that yes, all of the yogic teachings of quieting your mind are important for reaching these other ways of perceiving other regions of other dimensions of reality
It kind of makes
through
me think, Shelly, what you
consciousness.
were saying about, you know, with radio, how you were experimenting with, and other people have been experimenting with very, very low wattage, right? Instead of very high, powerful wattage. And then also what you were saying about your painting method, just allowing gravity to kind of do the painting for you, you know, allow the paint to be moved around by gravity itself. You've been paying, it seems like, very, very close attention to things that might seem small or insignificant to other people, right? Very nuanced things that you see a great deal of depth in things that seem very small, but actually are quite huge and expansive. And that makes me think of what you were saying about the universe, right? That it's both, it goes outwards and it goes inwards. It kind of goes in and out of itself, like that yin yang symbol that you were referencing. Um,
Yes, yes.
yeah.
The trick is to get out of the way. When you
Yes.
to get out of the way, you have to shut down you have to attenuate, quiet your normal mind, which is really loud and you know, it masks everything that's going on a much more subtle, smaller, more powerful level. So when you're able to shut down everything, um, that that's how I paint. In fact, you know, the abstract expressionists, to get for them to shut down their mind, they drink a lot of whiskey. They drink a hell of a lot. Jackson Pollock, for instance, alcoholic. He
Well,
was
you're segueing right into what I wanted to ask you about. I mean, first of all, Grant was mentioning earlier on that we just started a series with a man named Alan Steinfeld. I'm not sure if you know who he is, but he's a personality in this field, and he's very interested and very passionate in about art. And so we've started a series about abstract expressionists and, you know, people who are mediums who have been who have created this incredible art that comes from somewhere else, right? And they
Yes, yes,
talked about it coming from somewhere else, that they are the conduit. And then that
yes,
makes me think of your passion and enthusiasm for radios, because I like to think that each one of us is an antenna, right? We all have this ability to
yes, yes.
channel.
You
Yeah.
got it. Yeah, there's a
Yeah, it's
great book.
wonderful how it all intersects with each other, how everything connects to everything else. I just really enjoy that. And I really hear how you're pulling all these seemingly totally different things together. I kind of like, when you're saying that religions do not have to be mutually exclusive. It made me think of the earlier example you gave of the colander, that it's the same kind of concept, right? We put it in, it's one thing, it goes into this bowl, but we make it into all of these different things, but essentially it really is the same one thing, and it's all connected to each other, even though it's coming out of all these separate holes, we think, and therefore creating this illusion of it being separate. It really isn't. It's all coming from one source, from the same source. And I just love the connections you're making with that. And actually, I'd just like to hop on to, if it's okay with you, your own creativity, because I am thinking back to what you were saying a few minutes ago about this cycle within the implicate order of how the cycle of sort of create and destroy, create and destroy over and over again. And how I'm curious how that fits into your experience of creativity and what you think of the importance of creativity in terms of understanding consciousness, because of course creativity is a contact modality, right? It's a way of tuning in, it's a way of activating our antenna, it's a way of doing that. But I feel like there's so much more depth in creativity that I myself want to learn more about. And because you have such a long history of working on that on a personal level, and you also play accordion, which I think is so cool. I'm very curious to know how creativity for you fits into accessing all of this information, all this knowledge, being tuned in and understanding all of these things. What is the power of creativity in that for you?
Well, I have to mention one of the best books I ever read. I was about 25 or 26 in New York trying to paint on my own and learning about consciousness, meditation, and painting. I also got a complete set of Jung's works. It was a lot of money for me, but I was fascinated by Carl Jung, especially his volume Art and the Collective Unconscious. But I read also one of the books by one of his students, Eric Neumann, called Art and the Collective Unconscious. And it was an eye opener for me because he went through three different cases, three different artists historically. And his theory was that the collective unconscious flows through the artist if the artist can get out of the way, if the artist can kind of drop their own ego and just become a conduit to let the energies of creativity flow through them from the collective unconscious. So now I would say from out of the center, the implicate order, that this thing is, this existence we're in, this whole universe is creative. And what is creativity? It's the flow of energy trying to do new things and to communicate and to experience. And so I think that's why the abstract expressionists learned that drinking let them shut down their ego and their laptop mind so that this collective energy would flow through them into their canvas. And so I actually went through a stage for a year or two when I drank way too much when I painted. I would, and it worked, but I would drink and smoke cannabis too. And I would do some amazing things, that I didn't remember how I did them, but something did them. And I think it was the creative energy flowing through me. And I remember when I was in Saudi Arabia for many years, and sometimes I would speak with some of the Saudi friends. We weren't supposed to talk about religions, but I remember once saying that I said, I believe that Islam is the one true religion. And their eyes would get real big and say, really? Wow. I would say, yes, I also believe Christianity is the one true religion. And I also believe, every religion is like a different flower. And you can't really say that one flower, if God hadn't allowed all the religions to develop, it's just like letting all the flowers develop. They're all beautiful. So God is like the creative energy is unlimited in what it can do. So why can't it have multiple religions, all of them being true? To the extent that you believe in them, they are real. And so we're living in this interpenetrating multitude of dimensions where different people are living in different universes in a way. It's almost like every single tiny micro black hole is the origin of its own universe, and it's projecting the universe out from that center, and all of these different centers are intersecting in a really beautiful cosmic symphonic way. Um, so I stopped the drinking because I was feeling kind of sick drinking too much in my late 20s, and I shifted pretty much to just cannabis. And I do smoke cannabis when I paint. I meditate first, but I always would do it also ritualistic. I start painting on a full moon night,
Mm.
and I just try to do it as a meditative thing. I start out by a blank canvas. It's the hardest thing for a writer to have a blank page, or a painter to have a blank canvas. So you get up the courage to throw something on. Pick a colors and pick the viscosity. I would mix the paint with something maybe to make it thicker or thinner, and I would pour it or throw it on the canvas. And then I would say, well, I need to fix that up a little bit. So it becomes a dialectic of doing something and then trying to fix it. You do something and then you react to it by trying to make it better, you know?
Mm.
And
Mm.
it's that's I
So just
guess.
like the constant process of self-improvement.
Yes, and at some point, it takes on a life of its own. You almost feel like you're in the flow. There's some energy flowing through you from beyond you. Actually, I believe it's deep within you, at very subquantum levels. It's radiating out through your apparatus into the paint. And according to Eric Neumann, the goal of this collective consciousness doing art was to communicate with the wider human population through art. And the art was sort of the noospheric way of communicating, saying hello to human beings. So I love books, and so I have so many books that I still haven't read them all. But you always, you can find something that correlates with something else that you've studied and read.
Oh yeah, it's so easy to just go right down that rabbit
Yeah.
hole, isn't it? Because
So that
when you understand when you start understanding or realizing how everything is interconnected, it's so exciting. And then it's just endless, the possibilities of what you can learn, what you can read. I mean, I have a bajillion books that I haven't read yet, so I can
it
kind of relate to
definitely,
what you're saying. I
definitely.
think Grant might have a question for you, if that's all right.
Yeah,
Oh,
we're
sure.
coming up. We're coming up on 2 hours where we want to cut it off. I'd like to talk to you again down the road because you've got so much material. Um, Basically, two little simple. One's a simple question, or hopefully a simple question, and that is, I've written a number of books. You've written a whole pile of books. Sinead still has to write her first book. So, what would you say for a person who's writing books in terms of getting it done, where to
Oh,
start, that sort of thing?
sure.
And
Yeah.
then the final question I have for you is, when you look back on your life, what would you say to someone in terms of why are we here and what's it all about?
I
Uh,
love that question.
okay. In terms of writing books or painting paintings, I pretty much use the same technique I discovered writing my dissertation even. Um, you start out and you have a blank page. Maybe you don't have a good idea yet. So I write something that I'm really interested about. I and then I realize that I need to say more than what I just said. So I add something to it. And then
Mhm.
I go back to it as if I were doing a painting and creating problems that need to be solved. And
Hmm.
I don't start with a rigid outline that this is what I'm going to do. I go into it as an adventure that I'm, that I want to try to express things. Um, I don't feel that I've really said anything really new in any of my work, but what I've done is I've connected the dots among many interdisciplinary types of material that normally people wouldn't connect because I mean, not many engineers would read, you know, Vedanta or study Sanskrit, I suppose. So I've been lucky in the way that I've been able to absorb things from different traditions and different
Yes.
subjects. And then, you know, one thing that fascinated me in engineering school was they kind of drilled into us pattern recognition. What is pattern recognition? It means you should always look for a pattern. Look for a pattern. Look for ways things can be related and overlaid. You know, the things come in threes, or they come in fours, or you know, is this a process that seems that there's something similar process on some other subject? And by it's almost like data mining. You the more I read, the more I absorb, the more I have information in my stew pot to stir it all together and kind of bring out a new flavor. And so that's kind of how I write, I think. The other question, I think I forgot what you were saying.
The question about what's life all about in terms of you've written a lot of stuff, looked at a lot of stuff. Why are we here, and what are we supposed to be doing, and how do you put that all together?
Yeah, something I wish I could have instilled in my son and daughter, but I don't think I have. They're, you know, my son is a computer engineer and my daughter is a clinical psychologist. Um, but somehow they didn't inherit my love of of what I would call psychic self-development. I, I,
Mhm.
I maybe because of my being transgender, you know, I think early on, very early, like 4 or 5 years old, I wanted to understand myself. And then as I got older, I realized that there were a lot of subjects and techniques that taught you how to develop and evolve your own ways of your own psyche, your own sensitivity, your own way of seeing things. And then in yoga and Teilhard de Chardin, even I think Teilhard was one of the first people who wrote about the evolution of consciousness. He got really in trouble with the Catholic Church because he wrote about that consciousness was evolving, and and I found that fascinating. So I have had that as my main driving force was to evolve my own consciousness, hopefully to evolve it to where I could understand maybe why I was put here as a transgender person, and why I was put here as a person at all, and why any human is here. And I think it's to eventually reconnect back to the source. Uh, at some point, let the source, the implicate order, flow through you. Um, uh, and not only during meditation, but maybe during waking hours too. And I'm getting a little bit better at that. For instance, you know, walking in the forest, I'll see a tree that's maybe 200 feet away, yeah, down the road. I'll say, okay, I will try to empty my mind completely until I reach that tree. I will try to stop thinking as Shelly and stop memorizing and not even think about what I'm doing. Just walk and be aware, be totally aware, and let the universe flow through me, at least until I get up to that tree. So that's kind of a simple practice that I do when I go for walks. And
I
why
love
am
that.
I here? I still not sure why I'm here, but you know, maybe it's to write these books and write and paint these paintings. I have some paintings that I really love. So far, I haven't found an art gallery, but then I'm not much of a. I don't push them. I'm so busy reading and studying and painting more paintings. I and I live way out in the middle of nowhere, so there's not many art galleries around here. If anyone's listening, I have paintings on my website, shellyjoy.net, and I'd be glad to get to a gallery.
We will be including the link to your website, by the way, when this is posted online. We'll make sure that your website link is underneath the video, because this is just so fascinating. Shelly, you are like a renaissance, and I feel like I could keep eating up all this information forever. I particularly just want to say, because we're wrapping up now, that I really appreciate how you have tied in your own personal search for, you know, who you are, why you are the way you are. You know, I think this is a question that so many of us in this field and outside of it too can relate to. You know, what are we here for? What is the purpose? Why am I the way that I am? You know, I mean, I'm a deaf person. I've thought so much about that. Why do I have significant hearing loss? What is the lesson I'm supposed to be learning from this? You know, what does this bring to my life? And identity is such an important part of how we understand ourselves and how we develop our awareness and our consciousness. So I really appreciate you speaking about that personal journey of yours because of those reasons, and also because representation is incredibly important and representation is incredibly powerful, and people need to see themselves represented out there, right? To have that sense of validation that that, you know, we're okay the way that we are, and there's other people out there like us who can understand us, and that there's a reason why this is all happening. You know, that feeling of connection with other people that we can relate to is incredibly important. So I'm grateful for that. Thank you.
Thank you, Sinead, and thank you, Grant. I want to ask you something, Sinead,
Sure.
as a deaf person. Earlier this year, well, for decades, one of my main practices in meditation was called Nada Yoga, Nadam Yoga, listening, the yoga of the inner sounds. I've written about it in several of my books, how I first heard some high-pitched inner sounds within my brain, like high frequencies located in different spots. And by focusing on them, they get louder. And then I discovered there's a whole yoga school called Nada Yoga or Shabda Yoga. And
Okay.
but this year in January, after I had a failed tooth implant that was causing a lot of pain, they removed it. Like 3 days later, I suddenly had what I'm sure they call tinnitus, like amazingly loud, thousands of little tiny sounds of different frequencies in my brain area. And at first it was very claustrophobic, and I couldn't sleep very well for weeks. It was really horrible. But then I discovered that when I meditate, it's an amazing phenomena that helps me go deeper into meditation. I can focus on my heart and hear different sounds slightly, different parts. So I wondered, do you hear tinnitus at night when you're
I
quiet?
do not. I do not, but I do relate to what you're talking about for a couple of reasons. I had my own kind of huge awakening in summer 2019 when I was pretty much slingshotted into this field. I had not been part of it at all. I'm a newbie here. But a big part of what happened was that I had just had my second cochlear implant surgery on my right ear. And I noticed that I've had sort of unusual experiences all my life. So every once in a while I would have something odd happen and I would have a sense like there's something unusual about this. You know, I should pay attention to this, whatever this is. This is not
Yeah.
quite the usual thing. So I had already had my first cochlear implant surgery 5 years earlier, and that had been a totally different experience. What happened with this one um, was that I was having these incredibly strong I thought at the time were auditory hallucinations, like really, really intense, high pitched and reverberative sounds that
Yes, yes, yes.
yeah, that I also recognized too. And what made them stand out to me was a couple of things. One was that they happened very intensely and often all day, to the point that I would get very dizzy and almost pass out occasionally. It was
Yeah.
that strong. But that coincided almost exactly with my awakening. And then right after my awakening happened, they went away. And then there was a period of time after that when I kept hearing this I kept having this experience over and over again of hearing very loud kind of howling or blowing wind. And that was also tied into other experiences I ended up having. So there's some definite interesting correlations with sound and awareness and psychic, you know, tuning into your psychic abilities or tuning into your connectivity that I think has a lot to do with vibration. And
Yes.
yeah, and I'm very interested in that. I want to learn more about that so I can relate to you a little bit in that way.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Blavatsky wrote a great book, The Voice of the Silence, that I always
Hmm.
impressed me
Hmm.
quite a bit too. So there's a lot to that. I'm fascinated by it. I think it does connect you to other dimensions in some ways.
Yes, yes. It's so exciting just learning more and more and more about how all of these things do connect. And as you were saying, you know, the patterns that are out there that we can recognize everywhere, right? That demonstrate in material form often the interconnectivity between things. For example, so I'm deaf and I've had cochlear implant surgery, and the cochlea looks like a shell, right? It's a sort of in this swirl pattern.
Yeah,
And so shells are, of course, biological in the ocean. We come from the ocean. We are partially made of the ocean. We are also made partially of stardust. But then that spiral shell, you know, is found in so many examples in nature, ferns, all kinds of different things. and then also exists in really, really ancient symbology, which I'm sure you know of, right? That spiral that we see over and over and over again in many, many cultures, many ancient cultures all over the world. It's in cave paintings, it's all over the place. So things like that, I really also really enjoy. So I was happy you were pointing that out also.
Yeah, well, I gave my name Shelly because of that.
Mhm.
I renamed myself, you know, I had to. My name used to be Michael years ago.
Shelly, it's such a joy, ironically, because your last name is Joy, talking to you, and just really, really, truly a pleasure. This has been such a fabulous interview. And like Grant, I would love to speak to you again. I just think you have such a massive amount of knowledge to contribute. And thank you 3 times, as Grant would say. Thank you
Yeah.
3 times. So much appreciated. Please come back. We'll do a part 2 with you and just continue this amazing journey.
Well, thank you so much. And thank you, Grant. And I'll send you a whole bunch of pictures you might want to put on the
Beautiful.
YouTube video.
Please do.
We'll do
Please
that.
do.
Okay, have a great evening.
I
You
appreciate it.
too.
Love
Thank
you
you,
all.
Shelly.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.